welcome to a Minecraft Recurrent Complex tutorial. In today's videos we will be looking at the export functionality and how to actually make structures spawn in your world. I assume you have seen my previous tutorials on blocks, selector ones and commands. If you didn't, please go and have a look, as it might be really helpful, and I'll explain some techniques I will be using in more details over here. Now, let's start with some basics. You need to have a structure that you want to export. In my case, it will be this lovely smithy that I have built. As you can see, I have fitted the edges and several blocks below the actual building with the natural floor generic solid. It is not necessary, but it helps with integration into the terrain. If you don't do this, you might end up with floating platforms, like so. Of course, you can build the basement with other blocks, or with no basement at all, but for our purpose the natural floor blocks will do just fine. Now I type export, and the GUI opens to handle the export. First thing you want to do is give this structure a name. It can be any name that does not contain any special characters like hyphens, comma, points, apostrophes, spaces, and the like. The color of the indicator will turn red when there is no name in here or you have used some special characters that I previously mentioned. If the name already exists, this indicator will turn yellow. And if the name does not exist, as in this case, it will turn green. But I want to name my structure here my smithy, which I think I have already built. Yes, so it is yellow. Next is the save location, and you can choose between active, like so, inactive, world active, and world inactive. Only structures that have been saved in the active folders will be generated in your world. All files in the inactive folders are considered work in progress by the system, and it will not try to spawn them into your world. The difference between active and world active is that structures in the active folder will spawn in all your worlds. And if you go to the save game folder of a specific game, you will find another structures folder with active and inactive subfolders. These are the world folders. Anything in here will only spawn in that specific game world and nowhere else. The next three buttons are more or less self-explanatory. Rotatable and Mirrorable will do just that. It allows the structures to spawn in, facing any direction and even be mirrored. If you only want the structure to face a specific direction or not be mirrored, you should turn these off. Blocking means that no other structure can spawn in the same space as this structure. It is a toggle I recommend you leave enabled. I'm not sure how often it will happen that several structures spawn in the same place if you disable this feature, but I imagine the result is not beneficial to either. Then the next four buttons are where the magic happens. Actually, just the generation button. The metadata button allows you to provide an author's name, a comment, and very important web link to your Twitch, YouTube, or OnlyFans channel. Transformers and local toggles are black magic. I think in theory they allow you to adjust a spawned-in structure to look more aligned with its surroundings, like for example replace certain blocks with spruce wood for cold biomes, jungle wood for hot biomes, and so on. However, I haven't fully mastered these dark arts yet, so I can't tell you about it. Nevertheless, generation is already a handful, so let's continue here. Generation sets the rules for spawning structure into your game world. By default, the natural option is already set, but you can add or remove many more options as you like. Recurrent Complex provides the following options. In structure, Recurrent Complex says that you can spawn this in as part of a vanilla structure, like a village. So if you want a structure, say your custom built smithy, to spawn in a village, this is the option you need to select, and this is what I will do later on. Then we have maze component. If you want to build a maze, then you need maze components such as corridors, turns, dead ends, and so on. They should not spawn in the world all by themselves, but only as part of a maze, and that is when you select maze component. Natural, the structure can spawn in anywhere in your world. You get to define the rules, but in general, it can happen anywhere. And then we have sapling. And Recurrent Complex also allows you to build trees. I mean, whoever said a structure has to be a house? Of course, it can also be a tree. And if you want that tree to grow from saplings, you need to select sapling. Here you will define the pattern in which saplings need to be planted in order for them to grow a custom tree. Then we have static. If you want your structure to spawn at a very specific location, you have to use the static option. Say you are running a server with a tourist information building at x0 and z0. Then you need to select static and provide coordinates. The structure is an option you select when you want your structure not to spawn in directly, but to be selected from a list of structures. Say I have not only created this wonderful smithy over there, but 5 other smithies as well. And I want each village to have one smithy and one smithy only. Instead of choosing the InStructure option, I use structure list and a structure generator to accomplish my goal. More on structure generators in another video. Vanilla decoration. Remember the custom tree I spoke about? You do not have to wait for your custom tree to grow from a sapling. It can also be part of a normal world generation, like any other tree. In this instance, you select vanilla decoration. These are the 7 options. Many attributes of these options are the same, and once I have explained it in one option, I will not again explain it in another generation option, or this video would take ages. Now let's take a look at some of these options more closely. Starting with natural. The first value is a generation ID. It is a random value generated by the system, and usually you don't need to bother about it. Of course you can set one yourself, but you don't need to. I don't think you will be using ever a generation ID. Next is category, and that is basically a question of how often your structure shall spawn in the world. It ranges from frequent, which is 20 or every 25 chunks, over common, every 100 chunks, over adventure, to rare, and then ultra rare, which is once in every 6,666 chunks. As you have seen, the labels are not sorted in any particular order, so you have to left or right click until you get the right one. Also, you can hover over the option and see which or how often it will spawn. Next is weight. Weight can be used to reduce the number of chunks a structure spawns in even further, or increase it. Recurrent Complex checks each chunk for eligible structures that can spawn in there. It then adds the weight of all eligible structures to a sum and uses a random number to select one of the structures. Obviously, structures with higher weight will be selected more often than those with lower numbers. In order to change the base weight from 1, you have to click the button labeled with D on the right side. It will change to C and allow you to add your desired weight by using the slider. If you want to return to the default weight, simply click on C again. Here's the effect of weight in action. I use this wonderful and expressive structure to spawn in my world. I set it to frequent, so about every 25 chunks should feature this fantastic monument. I keep the weight at 1. Since it's the only structure in my active folder, nothing else shall spawn. Next, I made this slight variation of my monument. I also set it to frequent, but its weight. Now there are two structures in my active folder, and my generated world looks like this. Now let's have a closer look at Placer. The first argument here is baseline. Basically, you're telling Recurrent Complex at which block height in your selection the floor is. If we have a look at my smithy here, obviously I don't want my smithy to be that high up from the ground. If we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 blocks above the lowest blocks in my selection is where I want to set my baseline. And with this value, the smithy shall spawn in flush with the grass. Sources is about transformers and transforming blocks. As I said, it is black magic for now. If you're interested in block expressions, nevertheless, I recommend you check out the wiki page. Next up, we have presets. Usually, surface is selected by default. These presets define the places the structure can spawn on. The presets are surface, first nether surface, floor, half buried, liquid surface, and nether surface. I think the presets have pretty telling names, so you can imagine where it will be placed. You can click on O and see and edit what the individual presets mean. Each preset has a limit, and some have a match value. In case of surface, we have a limit and a match value. The limit value tells the mod not to spawn anything above world height. It also checks for a proper surface, which is neither water nor foliage. It also says to check from top down. All of this is very complex, and I'm not getting into details here. Luckily, we don't have to. Selecting one of these presets usually will be enough for the structure to work the way you want it to. Just select whether you want it to spawn on water or a proper surface, and you're good to go. And that's all for the placer. Next, let's have a look at biomes and dimension, which both work very similar. Here you can define in which biomes and dimensions the structure is allowed to spawn in. Both attributes come with a large number of presets, which you can easily modify by clicking the O button. A 0 means the structure shall not spawn in this place. For instance, by default, Overworld is selected and the structure will not spawn in any ocean biome but all land biomes. So you can set the value to any positive value just by clicking the slider. Technically, it will multiply the weight of the structure by this value. So you can create structures that spawn very often in desert biomes, but very rarely in any other biome. You can check the biome expressions on the wiki for more details, but usually you don't have to. Same goes for dimensions. You can set the weight multiplier for each dimension separately. Again, check the wiki for dimension expressions. The last attribute on this list is limitations. You can set a total amount of how often a structure is allowed to spawn per dimension. If the limit is reached, no more structures of this type will be spawned. And that is all for the natural generation option. Didn't I say this is a handful? Luckily, most of the other options are similar despite looking somewhat different. Take in structure, for instance. There is the generation ID. We can change the weight, we can set the front of our structure, and how often this structure shall be spawned in a village. This is a range with a lower and an upper bound. If you set the upper bound to, let's say, 1.2, it means that it can appear once in a village and there's a small chance for a second appearance. Amount scaled, again, is a little bit of black magic. But I assume it can multiply the amount of structures by the value by this value if the village happens to generate a large amount of custom structures. But I don't know. You can of course select biomes, so your structure will not spawn at certain village biomes, desert for instance. And then there's shift. We don't have baseline in here, as you might have seen, so I have to provide my 6 in here so it will spawn in flush with the ground. And that's it for in structure. Next up, maze. The maze ID is very important. Your maze generator block will refer to its components by this maze ID. The ID is unique per maze type, but not per maze component. So multiple components can have the same maze ID, like my great maze. You already know about weight, so we are gonna skip that. The connector ID is by default wall. You can name it anything you want actually. You can name it Paris if you like to. But it's best to keep it as the default value. It's just a name. When a maze is generated, it will only connect with other components that have the same connector name. A component with a connector ID wall cannot connect with a component with a connector ID Paris. In some cases, you want your components to connect in a special order though, like a power plug and a power socket. Recurrent Complex uses male and female denominators in this case, like male wall, which in turn will only connect to another component which has female wall, but not to something which is simply labeled wall. Under rooms, you define the size and shape of your room, but only measured in the amount of your base maze component size. I will get into more details here when I do a video about mazes. Please bear in mind that counting starts at 0 in this case, so the smallest room size is 0, 0, 0. You can use the plus sign to define any room shape as long as it is connected and you can draw it on a craft paper. Again, more on this in the maze video. Under exits, you can define the amount of exits your maze component has. In case of a corridor component, this is probably 2. Under reachability, you can define which components belong to each other. So let's say you have a 3-dimensional maze with several exits and several entries. You can define that one entry only has one specific exit. And you can do this by grouping these components in here. Now let's look at sapling. As I said earlier, you can define your custom tree to grow from saplings. However, you just can't place an oak sapling and hope it will generate your tree. In order for your tree to be generated by Recurrent Complex, you need to define a pattern in here, in which you want to place your saplings. So this, for instance, is a pattern of 2 by 2. Counting always starts at 0, and it uses this identifier sapling here to see what should be planted in here. You also have to define the ingredients which you will grow your tree. This doesn't have to be an oak sapling. You can use any combination of saplings, like oak, jungle, spruce, tree saplings, in let's say a 3 by 3 pattern, for instance. I guess in theory it can be any block. It doesn't even have to be a sapling. If you want to grow a redstone tree, why not define 4 redstone torches as saplings? When defining blocks from mods, make sure you use the mod name as well. And by the way, the identifier is just a name. You can also label it banana, Mars, or anything else. It is just an identifier. However, you need to address it in the pattern section again. The static is again very straightforward. The question is whether it shall be relative from the spawning coordinates of the player or directly to 0, 0. The placer is the same as with natural spawning. And you can restrict it to specific dimensions. See the wiki for dimension expressions. And you can decide to place it in a pattern. That is repeated for a couple of numbers along the x and z axis, y axis, and maybe provide a random shift as well. The structure list is similar to Maze ID. You can provide list ID, like my smithy list, and it will pick at random any structure from this list when you are using a structure generator. More on that later in another video. And last but not least, vanilla decorations. Vanilla decoration allows you to select which vanilla decoration you want to replace with this structure. And there are quite a few to select from. There's tree, village, big mushroom, cactus, desert well, fossil, mineshaft, nether pitch fortress, ocean monument, scattered feature, and stronghold. This option will replace the vanilla option with your structure instead. So theoretically, you can create your villages to look entirely customized at vanilla village spawn locations. I say theoretically because every time I chose the option, the game crashed after the second village the latest. I recommend you try it out yourself, and maybe it is just me and my machine. Which gets me to the final option of the export screen, and that is dependencies. Here you can define any mods that are required for the structure to spawn. If the mod is not present, it will not spawn. Say you have created a structure like a smeltery using Tinker's Construct blocks. If the game doesn't have Tinker's Construct, it doesn't make sense to spawn in a smeltery with blocks that do not exist in the game. So we would place mod t construct in here in the dependency field. I recommend you check the wiki page for dependency expressions. And now back to my smithy. I believe this only at complex structures because I only want it to spawn in villages and somewhere along the lines in here between, maybe in 50% I want one in here. And that's it, and I will save it under this name in active and save. And now I can see my smithy in action. And that's it. I hope you found this tutorial useful. Until the next time.